That's unprecedented. I've been given 1,000 lectures in 45 countries in 25 years. I've never been I've never been a feature of my own little featurette before. You're amazing. And I also want to say that I listened carefully to your membership club, and you've really pre-digested and organized the video information in a way that we dream about. I'm in that same 25 years, I've pulled together an enormous amount of materials, and there's just no way that we could have done what you did. I mean, highlight reels by topic, highlight reels by speaker. Oh, I mean, you must have put a lot of time in there, and I think it sounds like an amazing opportunity for people, so that they don't have to sort through a lot of things. They can go right to what they're looking for. Thank you on behalf of all of us on that amazing resource. Well, everyone, I'm going to correct something that was just said in the video that Ben did. My most recent documentary is not Secret Ingredients. It's called Don't Let the Gene Out of the Bottle. How dare you, Ben, leave that out? That came out Monday. That's right. It came out this week. So yeah, I'm going to forgive you. It's 16 minutes. It's very simple. It's very simple to watch. It's free. It's online. And it's designed as a global wake-up call. A global wake-up call to something that is enormous, amazing, urgent, existential, and demands our attention. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I also want to appreciate all the people that are here today listening in the comfort of your home. It would be great to again be live there at the conference. I have been at every single conference since the beginning. It's such a fun place to be, and I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. I am going to share my screen and walk you through the PowerPoint presentation that I have just put together for this purpose. And here we go. So the name of the lecture is Safeguard the Global Microbiome from GMOs. If you've been paying attention in the last 5 years, you know microbiome is the buzzword. But you may not know about the need to safeguard it from GMOs 2.0, and why this is something that I would say is among the most serious and urgent actions we can take as humanity. And I'll explain why during this talk. I wanted to let you know where you can watch the movie Don't Let the Gene Out of the Bottle. You can go to protectnaturenow.com. You can write that down now. You can click on it, but please do take note. Protectnaturenow.com. Take a picture of the screen. This is going to be an important website to know about by the time this lecture is over. And if you have to leave early, please go to Protect Nature Now, watch the 16-minute film, and as we'll talk about, participate in the advocacy platform, because the 2 or 3 or 4 minutes that you spend there can save the world. Now, we all know about invasive species. These are rabbits in Australia. This is something everyone can relate to, because rabbits multiply like rabbits, right? And there was 24 rabbits, there's more in this picture, 24 rabbits were released in Australia in 1859 to make visitors feel more comfortable so they can hunt rabbits. But there were no significant predators, and by the 1920s, there was over 10 billion rabbits. One well-meaning, compassionate, altruistic gesture to introduce rabbits into the countryside so that foreigners would feel more comfortable decimated the countryside, costs Australia still over $600 million a year, and changed the nature of nature. That was one invasive species. Now we have the possibility to permanently alter and corrupt the gene pool of virtually every species. In the last 25 years, there's been 12 genetically modified food crops. In the next 25 years, because of gene editing, we have the capacity to make that number hundreds of thousands or millions, especially when we talk about the microbes. Genetically engineered crops, organisms, microbes persist and propagate in the environment and can change once they're released. This is the first part of the recipe for disaster. GMOs can self-propagate and are permanent. There's no recall. The second is that the most common result of GMOs is surprise side effects, including the new poster child of genetic engineering, gene editing, causing massive collateral damage in the genome and the organism. So you have a GMO released permanently in the environment that can create side effects. Now, with gene editing, we know the name CRISPR, there's other names as well. It is so cheap and easy. You can buy a do-it-yourself kit on Amazon for $169. For $2,000, you can build a gene editing lab in your garage, and you can name and release a new GMO microbe every day of the year for the price of dinner each time. And the prices are going to go down and the powers are going to go up. But you're not going to be able to keep up with the biotech industry, who drives robots using artificial intelligence to create massive numbers of combinations that could result in massive releases. So this is the combination for disaster. GMOs are permanently part of the gene pool. They're prone to side effects. And now if we don't stop it, every high school biology class, every college biology class, every home hobbyist, and all these corporations and governments and research institutions will be replacing nature. And the reason why it's a recipe for disaster is because the biotech industry has convinced governments around the world to turn a blind eye to gene editing. The European Union said, no, we're going to treat them like GMOs. They came under massive pressure. When the UK left the EU, now there's a big debate going on in the UK to try and turn a blind eye to gene editing. And Canadian government officials are now under siege. And there's members of the Canadian government that want to say we should not pay any attention to gene edited products. And that's virtually what it's like already in the United States and some other countries. So if this happens, then everything with DNA can be targeted, from bacteria to butterflies, from algae to animals. Everything with DNA can be changed in a cheap and easy way, redirecting the streams of evolution for all time. So rather than one invasive species added to an ecosystem, the entire ecosystem can be redesigned and be, in a sense, invasive species. Now, of all of the kingdoms that you can genetically engineer, microbes are by far the most hazardous. Certainly, we did not need the pandemic to know that microbes can travel the world. But they can also damage or collapse ecosystems and create health issues, even pandemics. If we genetically engineer a cow, its offspring and its offspring and its offspring take a number of years. But as we'll see with microbes, their influence can be global in short order. And again, the pandemic makes an especially perfect example for a fertile imagination of this planet when inserting these concepts. So let's talk about engineering the microbiome and what that could mean. First of all, microbes are everywhere. They have been found in every single part of the planet. You dig down into the crust, they're there. You go into lava pits, they're there. They're in the atmosphere. And they are an essential component of biology and ecosystems. And we're just learning about their amazing qualities. They evolved over millions of years with a level of intelligence that is breathtaking. In fact, we can't fully understand or replicate it. I remember talking to microbiologist and microbiome expert Kiran Krishnan, who said, if you gave me all the money in the world and 10,000 of the top scientists, they couldn't create even a single microbe that they have identified that can enter the gut and sense what's going on and surround pathogens and change the population of pathogens and increase diversity. There are superheroes in the microbiome that defy our understanding. But it also helps define who we are. This is really cutting edge. And you may have heard, for example, that there are 10 times more microbes in our bodies than there are human cells. Well, that doesn't really define it. It's way more than that. First of all, the microbes can train us. Let's say they want to interact with other people in order to swap genetic material and inoculate with more microbes. They can generate hormones and neurotransmitters that make us more social. They can have us crave a cupcake if they want more sugar. Whatever they want, they can, in many cases, they can drive our actions for them. And then if we're doing what they want, they can send neurotransmitters to the reward center of the brain, training us. We didn't know this. Now, we might resent it and say, hey, you guys, stop that. But we actually need them. And what they do for us is worth us doing for them. You see, we have 22,000 genes in our DNA. An earthworm has more. Hello, an earthworm has more. But we extend our genetic library by incorporating 3.5 million genes of the microbiome inside of us. And it really is what we can say our shared property. For every gene in our body, there are 360 microbial genes. These microbes conduct approximately 90% of metabolic functions. There's no there's no gene in our body that can evaluate the nature of the leaky gut and tell the human system to replace a particular cell and increase the mucosal layer in a certain way. That's outsourced. That's outsourced to the microbiome. When a woman has breast cancer, the micro Jedi army sends certain bacteria there to help encapsulate. When they got rid of the bacteria, the tumor spread. For Alzheimer's patients, another Jedi army of fungus will occupy to protect. There's all sorts of shifts and changes that occur when we are sick and need it, and also ways of evaluating whether we're sick and need help. But there are also just daily metabolic functions that are just outsourced to the microbiome. Now, the community of the microbiome has a balance. It has a diversity. If you change the balance and you change the diversity, it can have profound consequences. Now you know I'm talking about GMOs, but I haven't said it yet, so we'll get there. A change in the community of the microbiome has been linked to most chronic illnesses. My friend Kiran Krishnan says about 80% of chronic illnesses can find their roots in the microbiome. That is ridiculous. That is ridiculous and true. That the microbiome community can dictate all the brand name diseases, or most of them, that you know about. Now, if we introduce new genetic elements from genetic engineering that were not part of the millions of years of evolution, what can happen? First of all, they're doing it. Pivot Bio is introducing genetically engineered microbes into the soil. So is JoinBio, which is a joint venture of Monsanto Bayer. So they're releasing these microbes in fields in the United States already. What can happen? First of all, microbes travel the world. As I said before, we didn't need a pandemic to know that. In the film, Don't Let the Gene Out of the Bottle, Professor Elaine Ingham was told by whistleblowers at the EPA about a secret study that they still don't acknowledge that verified that genetically engineered bacteria travel everywhere on the planet. When the genetically engineered microbe travels, it will interact with vastly different ecosystems. So the probiotics released in a Midwest farm, which may have a measurable positive effect, could end up in our babies, could end up in the oceans, could end up in the atmosphere with very different results. And one of the reasons is, and this is one of the reasons why the microbiome is so intelligent, is that they are networked far better than humanity by swapping genes. They go to a big swap meet every time they're in a discussion. They're sharing genes, they're sharing genetic material, and choosing and taking them for a test drive to see if they gain some survival advantage. And this means that if we introduce a genetic component into a microbe from GMO, it might exchange with the ecosystem in the atmosphere, in the oceans, in our bodies. In fact, it is very common for microbes to enter our bodies from the food we eat, but also from our skin and also from breathing. And they swap with the microbiome in our bodies. In fact, recent research this year shows that the rate of swapping, called horizontal gene transfer, is increased in industrial areas, in more built up areas as opposed to rural. Now, all of this means we have unknown consequences. We don't even know how to define what a healthy microbiome is. So if we're introducing a new microbe that has a genetic element that was not part of the millions or billions of years of evolution, and it takes up residence in our system, all bets are off. Let's talk about children with the microbiome. Some of the ways that we have evolved with microbes are stunning. And let's talk about how a child gets inoculated with the microbiome. It's, first of all, in the birth canal, there's microbes there that help support conception, fertility, pregnancy. But in the second trimester, new bacteria come whose purpose is to digest milk. Because when the baby goes through the birth canal, it becomes inoculated with that bacteria, and now their microbes can digest milk. So they get inoculated in the birth canal. About 30% of their microbiome comes from breast milk, but it's more than that. The skin around the nipple gives about 10% of the microbiome to the baby. So they're getting it from the milk, they're getting it from the birth canal, they're getting it from the skin contact, some say the placenta. And when the baby needs things for its health, the microbes in the baby's saliva on the baby's skin transmit that back to the mother, which can change the structure of the milk to support the baby. Now, what's interesting is a significant percentage of the breast milk is indigestible by the baby. It's designed to feed the microbiome. Now, do you get it? We have, I'm going to take it off of screen share for a minute because I want to see your faces. Do you get that we have evolved for millions of years so that our whole system, the mother's whole system, has been created to inoculate healthy microbiome and to feed the microbiome? And if the microbiome is healthy in the infant, it sets up better health, not only for the rest of the life of the infant, but future generations. So we have not only outsourced so much of our intelligence and necessity to the microbiome, we've worked with it so that we support it, it supports us. We feed it, it feeds us. In fact, it is part of our digestive system, it is part of our immune system, it is part of our detoxification. It is so fundamental that if we start making changes in that community with unknown consequences, it could be a disaster. Coming back to PowerPoint. How do we deal with this now? What do we do? We have a campaign now called Protect Nature Now. We're building a global coalition. We're mainstreaming the message. And we want to implement strict laws and regulations to protect the global microbiome. Now, the timing of our enterprise is urgent because you can now genetically engineer through gene editing microbes in your basement for price of dinner. But the timing is also amazing because of the pandemic. It has sounded the global alarm. And there is an unmet need in the population to heed its lessons. And so we have structured the film, Don't Let the Gene Out of the Bottle, which I started before the pandemic. We shifted, it was just about the microbiome. We shifted it around so that it would be receiving the wisdom and responding to the wisdom of society that had been imparted by the pandemic. So there's a big controversy about the source of the COVID-19 virus. Did it come from a bat or a pangolin, if that's the name of how to say it, or the Wuhan lab? It's a controversial issue. We don't need to pay attention to that. All we need to do is say, look at the bird flu, H5N1. The H5N1 bird flu is as much as 24 times more deadly than the COVID-19 virus. It's hard to get because you have to be around birds a lot. So it doesn't go person to person, it goes bird to person. So you have to be raising birds, they have to have the virus. And then if you get it, chances are you will pass away. 52% at one count died from the avian flu. So the death rate is enormous. Some say it's at least 24 times more deadly than the COVID-19 virus. It could be way more than that. But the safety is it doesn't transmit easily. So what did the genetic engineers do? They created an airborne version. This was such a shock to the scientific community. They said, this is crazy. I mean, can you imagine the decimation to humanity if the death rate of that virus got out? So there was a call to stop what's called the gain of function or genetic enhancement of the infectiousness or the virulence of these pathogens that can create pandemics. And in 2014, there was a law to pass that, or Obama put out a statement saying there should be no funding except under specific circumstances. And then it was removed in 2017. Now that USA Today has done their report and others have done their report, verifying that we have not at all mastered containment, that hundreds of labs and thousands of incidences have shown that even the most secure labs in the world, like the CDC lab that handles anthrax and flu, had to be shut down or admitted that they had accidental releases that could have been catastrophic. So there's no justification for testing fate. Now, this is a logical conclusion. We're all in the throes of the effects of the pandemic around the world from all these levels, and we could all imagine, or choose not to, what if it were the avian flu that was airborne? So it's an easy ask at this point. But in the film, you'll see, I say, and while we're at it, let's implement other lessons. Instead of just no enhancement of potentially pandemic pathogens, let's say no release of any GMO microbes whatsoever. And we know from the pandemic that they spread around the world, but we also know that there are certain bad actors that were nearly released that might have caused enormous, unprecedented damage. And we bring them up in the film. One is a bacterium called Klebsiella planticola. And in the 90s, it was the subject of headlines because it almost got out. It was scheduled to be released. And as you'll see in the film, I'm not going to give it away, from someone who was intimately involved in it, who spoke about it at the UN, it could have theoretically ended terrestrial plant life. Ended terrestrial plant life. Then there is another bacterium, Pseudomonas syringae, which could have theoretically changed weather patterns in the world, because bacteria in the atmosphere helps create rain and ice and snow, and they had created an impotent version, which if it had escaped as planned and it had displaced its natural counterpart, those are ifs, but if it had done that, it could have changed the weather patterns. So we wake people up by these potential bad actors, but we also know that even changes in the microbiome that are subtle can mess up that brilliant intelligence. So we want to prevent the release of any genetically engineered microbes, abolish the genetic engineering enhancement of potentially pandemic pathogens, and for facilities that are using or creating GMO microbes, we want them to implement appropriate safeguards, including appropriate disposal. But we want to go further. We want to assign strict liability costs should any release occur. This gives our laws teeth, because the biotech industry would say, oh, we don't have to worry about genetically engineered microbes. There's no problem. We have it under control. But then, if you say to them, well, if they're so easy, if they're so safe and so predictable, then there should be no problem if you take full responsibility for any environmental, health, or economic damage associated with an accidental release. Now they have to pay attention. Will my genetically engineered microbe be what it was supposed to be from our design of the process of gene editing? A lot of these people do not actually test the outcomes of the gene editing process. They just assume if it does what they intended to do, then the sequence is what they want. There's no collateral damage and it's available for prime time. They can release it. So they might go, well, if we're responsible for any damage, let's perhaps for the first time actually sequence the genome, sequence the RNA, look at the proteins, look at the metabolites, and see what we've created. The next question they asked was, will it get out? And if it gets out, will it mutate? How are the ways it mutate? Can we predict that? And whether it's as designed or mutated, how will it interact in every potential ecosystem that we know about? And with the genes that we have changed, what if those genes get swapped to the different systems? Now, they don't just get exchanged with the same bacteria, they get exchanged with other microbes. And there's even, according to research this year, demonstration of horizontal gene transfer between plants and animals. And so they have to think, where will these genes go? And then if they get out, how do we monitor them? How do we clean them up? How big is our liability? Well, it doesn't take very long to watch the dollar signs go up, and they realize that their empty promises that it's safe and predictable, when they turn it into dollar signs, becomes, wait a minute, we need to rethink this as if it really matters. And what may matter to them is the money. What may matter to everyone else is our microbiome, our children's microbiome, and the microbiomes all over the planet. So we are creating white papers, legislative briefings. We have social media support for members of Congress, both at the state and federal level. We have support for media, so we have looking to select advocates. We want to introduce bills at all levels in all jurisdictions around the world and in international treaties. We want to recruit and train people to work with us and expand everywhere. Now, on our site, you can go to the advocacy platform. This is from there, and it brings you through 6 steps. And I guide you through with little 1 minute or 30-second videos as to what to do below. And one of the things you can do below is enter your zip code and your address, and all of a sudden, all of your elected officials, this is in the US, all of your elected officials come up. And when that happens, you get to, in a single click, send them all an email, and you can customize it, send them a tweet, customize it, and send them a post on their Facebook page. All pre-written to give you an idea of what you can say. You can send it without changing. We recommend customizing. But in any case, now your minute or two on that platform has conveyed to your elected officials that this is important to you. And we know from elected officials who've told us that they're interested in this issue and want to see if their constituency is. So they're looking for you to respond. In the same platform, you can sign a petition that we will use around the world. You can send a press release with a little letter that's, again, you can send it as is or change it to 5 media in your area, because they all come up based on your zip code. And you can share information on your social media. So this is an advocacy platform like no other, because in 3 to 5 minutes the first time, and then 2 minutes thereafter, every time we call for a new campaign, you'll already know how to navigate. You can have 100 different actions or more. Multiply that by 10,000 activists, and now we have demonstrated overwhelming support for this issue. And that can be the motivator to have these members of Congress become champions. And we have interest on both sides of the aisle. Now, in addition to the governments, we have non-governmental policy and implementation. We want institutional review boards at universities to not allow studies that involve the release of GMO microbes. And if they involve the creation of them, they should be very carefully controlled and disposed of appropriately. We want scientific associations to step up so that they support reasonable, responsible preventive measures for all of their members. Companies to come forward, academic and research institutions, and investors to drive their investment dollars appropriately. Now, we want to build a coalition. And if you think, who should be part of this coalition? Well, let's start with climate change people. Climate change, if we just widen the lens a little bit, it becomes planetary survival. Oh, that's us, planetary survival. Think about regenerative agriculture. They want the microbiome to do the heavy lifting, to create new soil, to sequester carbon. Oh, that's us. We want to think about the animal rights people. They want to allow animals to have a healthy system and function as nature intended. Oh, that's us. Birders, gardeners, people involved with children's health, right? Health of all types, organic advocates. We're all connected to the microbiome. So if you breathe, eat, or live in something called nature, it's an issue that affects you. Now, in the nonprofit world, which I've been in for decades, people think in terms of silos, meaning this is my area. In this case, the microbiome is a foundation for many of these areas. And so we're asking different organizations, and you may be part of one, you may run one, to get the word out, not to change your focus, but just to add this as a plank to your platform. So we have over 40 official allies. We want 4,000. We want allies around the world with billions, ultimately, of members, subscribers, readers, etc., who will share our information, sometimes customizing it for their area. So we bring information for instant global movement. And we need it because we can't wait 25 years to build a movement after so many microbes have been released. So we provide materials for others to share. Like, don't let the gene out of the bottle. Please watch it and share it. And we are focusing on messaging to make it part of popular culture so that everyone understands that we have arrived at an inevitable time in human history where we can redirect the streams of evolution for all time, and that we now have the capacity to damage all living beings and all future generations. So we have a new responsibility with this technology to protect all living beings and all future generations. I was on George Norrie, Coast to Coast AM radio with George Norrie last night for a couple of hours, and someone called in and said, this is like an atom bomb. And I said, I use that analogy. I said, we wouldn't give an atom bomb to an infant and say, oh, don't press the blue button. Just don't press it, it would be bad. Everyone knows that. It is so obvious. It is so easy to understand. But in our narrow thinking in time and space and biology, we didn't have the same concern, I imagine, in 1859 when they released 24 rabbits in Australia. It was like a biological time bomb, slow motion over time, destroying or damaging an ecosystem. We want the world to understand that giving a gene editing kit to just anyone and say, here, create a new organism and release it. Create a new microbe, create a new viral sequence, create a new archaea, fungus, algae. Have at it. Change the nature of nature. GMO means God move over. Take it and run with it. If we do that, it is like a biological time bomb. We don't have that understanding yet in our civilization, but we have the capacity. So we want to convey that, and we want to convey it through curriculum and movies and books and articles and meetings and conferences, and with grassroots advocates and speakers that we will train, so that in a few years, the world knows about it, at least as much as they know about climate change, so that it becomes a fundamental of this culture, of this civilization, that we have achieved a moment that was inevitable, and it takes a new responsibility for us to safeguard biological evolution as we know it, and not destroy biological evolution as we know it. We have the capacity to do both. One of the ways that we are messaging is that we'll be teaching people about the microbiome, as I did today. Kiran Krishnan, who's an expert at the microbiome, Michelle Perro, a pediatrician, another expert, they're on board with educational information that help us love the microbiome, and we protect what we love. You probably know more about the role of the microbiome in your body today than you did before. We could talk about the amazing fecal transplant discoveries when you take fecal matter from one organism and put it into another, including humans. You can transfer disease, you can transfer health, you can transfer a tendency to gain weight, to lose weight, mood, etc. It's part of a programming that we don't understand. So we need to love and protect our microbiome and allow its intelligence to evolve and continue to express. One of the most important aspects of our movement is the ability to become big quickly. You see, we need to open an office in Brussels and work with the European Union. We need to have a presence in the UK, which is under assault from the biotech industry. We need a presence in Canada. We need a presence in China, in Africa, in South America. We need it at the international level, the national level, local level. We need training. In fact, we created an organizational chart and said, okay, if we're fully funded in the US with just one office in Europe, how much would that cost? It was millions of dollars. And I am very bold today to say this issue deserves the millions of dollars so that we have a functioning global movement. Now, in the same way that The Real Truth About Health will have a financial foundation and a few people giving, or many people giving on a regular basis to a membership, we invite you to donate to the Institute for Responsible Technology, a registered nonprofit, on some monthly basis, $5 a month, anything that you can afford. Yes, of course, we want the millionaires and the billionaires to step up and fund the whole thing, but I'm inviting you to join a team where we get to act together. We get to be the microbiome whisperers acting on their behalf, and not just the microbiome, but all living beings and all future generations. So I'm boldly asking like I've never asked, like I have had trouble asking in the past. But I feel like, why not channel nature? Why not speak on behalf of all living beings and all future generations and say, it's worth a monthly investment. And we will protect the expenditure of that money so it goes directly to changing laws and education. Because those are the two things that's needed. Now, I know for 25 years, I've been very much involved in movement building on GMO front, a different angle, focusing on educating people about the health dangers. When I started in 1996, there were no other nonprofit organizations that focused on the health dangers. So I bet on the right horse saying, no, actually the health dangers are the key to drive consumer dollars to change the entire supply chain. Or as others were talking about, the environmental risks, et cetera, et cetera. And it worked. So my books, 5 movies, travels to 45 countries, it worked. We were focusing on education. We're focusing on building that up. It took 25 years. We don't have 25 years now because because gene editing has changed. Gene editing makes it so quick and easy to genetically engineer that we need to move quickly. And so we've pivoted. I will still talk about the health dangers of GMOs and Roundup. I did last night on George Norrie, but yesterday's live discussion, we did a panel discussion for Earth Day with Kiran Krishnan and Michelle Perro and Dr. Michael Antonio and Jim Thomas and I. We were focused on the microbiome because that's the new wave of information. And it turns out there is receptivity because the entire regenerative agriculture is there. All of the healthcare practitioners in functional medicine are there. All we have to do is say, we're protecting the microbiome. I see some hands raised and I will call on people in just a moment. Let me just finish up right here, tell you where you can go to help and support, and maybe some of the questions. If you go to protectnaturenow.com, you will see our advocacy platform where you'll be able to tell Congress and local officials and media and your social media. So go to the advocacy platform. Watch and share the film. Don't let the gene out of the bottle. And please make a donation, ideally on a monthly basis. And there you'll also find resources. And as we invest in more staff, we can take our massive and growing library and provide it in courses and training and advocacy in a way that's easy to digest. Right now, we've just sorted it for you, and we continue to sort it every month because there's new information coming in. So please join the movement now. There is no Planet B. I'm going to take questions now, and if there's time at the end, I'll introduce a new topic of GMOs 2.0, but let's just answer some questions first, Ben, and then if we have some more time after that, I have another slide deck of material that was presented in yesterday's live panel discussion.
Jeffrey, thank you so much for all of this invaluable information for all of us. And yes, as I'm sure some of you saw in the chat box, what we'd like to have you do is go to your reactions tab on your Zoom screen, and there you can click on raise hand, and you'll be able to come in and ask Jeffrey Smith a question directly. What we'll do is, as the raised hands come in, we'll take them in order by which we receive them, and we'll call on you and we'll ask you to unmute. And so with that, Jeffrey, the first person I see in our list here is Bev. Bev D. And so Bev, go ahead and unmute yourself if you're not already, and please go ahead, keep it brief and direct for Jeffrey. Thank you.
Jeffrey, I just wanted your opinion on this whole COVID-19 and how this is going to affect the future generations.
You know, I get a lot of questions, as you probably imagine, on COVID-19 virus, on the vaccines, and it's certainly a hornet's nest, and it's certainly a politicized thing, and there's certainly forces lining up on both sides. What I speak about is very specialized, and I have tremendous confidence in my knowledge because I ask lots of scientists and double check with what I say. And so I tend to shy away from comments on things outside of my area. And in this case, that actually works way in our favor. I was talking to someone who was lobbying in DC, trying to get the Congress to investigate the origins of the COVID-19 virus. And it was a Republican yes and a Democrat no. So it became a political issue, not a scientific issue. And so what did we do? We skirted around it. In the movie, Don't Let the Gene Out of the Bottle, we say the lessons of the pandemic, forget about its origin. Look at H5N1. It's like, squirrel, look over here. We don't need to worry about the controversy of COVID-19. It has prepped humanity with the awareness of microbes traveling, the awareness of microbes wreaking havoc. So we don't have to alienate people by weighing into that controversial area about the vaccines, about the origin of the virus. And also, frankly, I'm not an expert, so I'm not going to go there because my habit over 25 years was if I don't know about something, I shut up. And it helps me because I remember being on a panel, a George Norrie panel at the Health Freedom Expo. There was tremendous controversy going back between about 10 different doctors, and they were arguing and all that. And George said, okay, close up with a 1-minute summary. And I said, there's obviously a lot of controversy up here about health, but everyone agrees with me. Don't eat GMOs. The place erupted. And it was true. No one had an argument because I wasn't hanging my hat. It's a strategic position, and it's also a wise for us to simply not comment. So thank you for your question, and I'm going to frustrate you by saying, squirrel, look over here.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Up next, we have John. John L. is up next. John, if you would go ahead and unmute yourself. Thank you.
Hi, I was wondering, how do you stop the release of the gene editing? Are you talking about making the cheap gene editing equipment illegal and preventing their sale? And also, if someone is doing this homegrown editing, how does it get out in the world?
Great question. So Our goal for the legislation is to have laws that prevent the release of all genetically engineered microbes. So if that's true, then the stock price for those companies that are selling the gene editing kits will probably go down. I admit there will be some collateral damage among the industry that's involved with releasing genetically engineered microbes, but at the same time, we're protecting all living beings and all future generations. So we think the trade-off is worth it. So yes, it's not about specifically, John, just those kits. It's more the concept of anyone creating microbes. Now, imagine the Impossible Burger. By the way, friends don't let friends eat the Impossible Burger. It has genetically engineered soybeans. It's soaked in Roundup, and they take genetically engineered yeast to produce the blood red heme, which has never been part of the human food supply. That same fermentation vat also ends up, let's call it dirty, and they just put all that with 46 additional uncharacterized proteins into the food that you eat. And now you're eating a product of genetic engineering with potential side effects. They are using the yeast, genetically engineered, to produce this heme. How do they dispose of the yeast? Do they dispose of it in such a way that it is guaranteed not to survive in the wild? We don't know. We understand that they're following the laws of disposal per county. Well, how many counties are paying attention to the fact that a live release of a microbe can cause imbalances in ecosystems around the world? So when we talk about preventing the outdoor release, our Protect Nature Now requirements would be, okay, if you want to use the microbes indoors in a secure environment and they're not pandemic pathogens, you can. But you must build safeguards, you must dispose properly, and here's the kicker. If it does get out, you pay. So you can't offload the cost of a release to taxpayers. You are fully responsible. That gives them the pause. Is it worth using genetically engineered yeast if it may cost us in case we disrupt the ecosystem? So by virtue of banning the outdoor release and assigning liability, we think wisdom will prevail and we will protect. That is our plan, but we have to do it around the world, John. We can't just do it in the United States because microbes will come in from anywhere.
Jeffrey, thank you. We now have a question coming in from Joel C. Joel, if you'd go ahead and ask your question now.
Hello, Jeffrey. It's good to see you again. Since being on my radio show in 2003 in Tampa, I've been following you with great interest and admiration, respect, and motivation. So thank you for your endless energy. Jeffrey, when you talk about liability, you talk about legislation and laws, and the release of these things we've seen with GMO foods and how proliferating they are and how damaging they are and the pesticides that come along with it. But how do you wake up sleeping politicians to say, stop? We can't sue violators when the cost is so great, the potential catastrophe is so great.
You know, it's a great question, Joel, and thank you for that interview in 2003. I remember my visit, was it Nature's Bear Patch or something? Nature's
Food Patch.
Yeah, Nature's Food Patch. Great, and it was like 250 people there. I remembered it was just, 18 years ago. So it's interesting. I have worked with politicians all over the world, and I've testified, I've convinced politicians to make changes. I've convinced entire governments to make changes. But whenever I've walked the halls of Congress In the past, it was kind of depressing because they were marching so in lockstep with Monsanto. When I would give presentations, the staff would get it and they'd sit with me and say, okay, I love your plan, but here's what you need to do. And they'd lay out a plan. It would be multiple years, lots of money, and it would still possibly fail. So I went, okay, in the US, I'm not going to attach my success based on the decisions of Congress. I can just do it with consumer choice. And so we did, and 51% of United States consumers think that GMOs are unsafe, 48% around the world. So we've been a massive success there without having to change government policy. So first of all, I'm in a new area. So I'm getting help from people who understand how to change government policy. And what I learned from them is that the timing is perfect for this on Capitol Hill. The timing is perfect for this in state legislatures. Why? Because people have this unmet need to do something about the pandemic, to implement the lessons, and there's enough instant understanding, Joel. I'm sure as you were listening to me, you've been following me for so long, but there may be people listening today that have never actually considered that gene editing could replace nature, so that we actually have no future generation that inherits nature from its own evolution, but we've interfered with it in massive releases. No one has perhaps thought of the incredible changes for the microbiome. But what we do know is it takes just a few minutes to get it. And it doesn't take a lot of complicated science. It's arithmetic, little genetic time bombs prone to side effects, surviving in the wild, interacting with different ecosystems. At what point will it be a rabbit in Australia? At what point will it be a cane toad in Australia? At what point will it be kudzu? At what point will it collapse an ecosystem? Or our infants, or future generations. So the conveyance turns out to be easy, which from a strategic messaging standpoint is critical. If it took me 10 minutes to finally get the understanding that, oh, this is a problem, that would be a lot harder movement to start. So I think from what I've heard is that there are people in Congress who are very interested in this. And it's interesting, we have people on both sides of the aisle, and in the Department of Defense, and in Homeland Security, and in National Security Advisor levels, who've been talking about the dangers of gene editing for years and acknowledge that the technology has outpaced the regulation and something needs to be done. So we have odd bedfellows here supporting. So I think actually it's going to be a lot easier. Also, strategically, we're not talking about banning genetically engineered corn and uprooting, literally, a multi-billion-dollar industry. There's very few companies that are actually releasing genetically modified microbes right now. So the infrastructure is not in place, which gives us another urgency to do this now before they do set up that infrastructure. So I think from a strategic standpoint, it works.
Jeffrey, at the moment, those are all the questions we have. Now, you mentioned that if we had some time after that you had some other slides you'd be open to sharing with us. So
yes,
if you're good for that, let's do that. And then at the end of that, perhaps there are a few more questions that will pop up.
Sure.
Great, thank you.
Okay, all right, let's come back now. What we're going to talk about now is called gene drives. And I'm going to share the screen with slides that I was gracefully given, or we could say I stole, but I got permission, from Jim Thomas of the ETC group. And it's the gene drive dilemma, as reported in the New York Times Magazine, is that we can alter an entire species. But should we? Now, normally, if mama fly and papa fly mate, and mama fly has a particular trait, then that trait will go to half the offspring. So you end up in the next generation, you have one that has the trait and one that doesn't. Then they mate with someone else. The one that didn't have the trait, well, that entire line, that entire genealogy is without the trait. But the side that does have the trait, again, one of the offspring has it and one doesn't. The one that doesn't, their entire genealogy doesn't. Those that have it again, splits it. So by the fourth level, as you can see on the screen, you have one fly that has the trait and 7 that don't. That's normal reproductive distribution of genes. In gene editing, okay, this is 4 generations of flies. In gene editing, the altered gene always spreads. So let's say your gene is on one chromosome and normally on the other chromosome, it's not there. Well, you've inserted genetic material to copy the gene that you want and put it on both chromosomes. So that means all of your offspring are going to get that trait. But you see, you've also passed on the genetic machinery. So in their DNA, they make an extra copy on both chromosomes, so all of their children get it, and so forth. So by the 4th generation, you have 8 flies that have the trait when you only started out with 1. So just to go back, previously you had 1 fly out of 8 in the 4th generation, and now you have 8 out of 8. So now you see where we're going, especially for the organisms that multiply very quickly. You're driving a trait through the species. So this was discovered when these guys put this together with a trait that turned a fly yellow. And they put it in a box for a couple of weeks. I think 1 fly. And when they opened the box inside what was considered a closed chamber, they said, quote, "We were stunned because nothing but pale yellow flies kept emerging." One person said it was like the sun rose in the west rather than the east. And one of the proponents of gene drives was scared and continues to be scared about what if there's an escape. He said, "My nightmare is a wave of yellow flies spreading across the country." Now, whether a fly is yellow or not may impact the ecosystem, may impact the traits of their predators or their prey, their taste, their quality. But you can drive all sorts of things. And because genetic engineering is a leaky technology, what you put into one organism could end in another organism, changing that organism's fate. It can mutate, it can become silent, and the process of genetic engineering can create collateral damage, which also can be passed on. So if you have a fast reproductive cycle with microbes, small mammals, etc., you're driving changes in the entire system. You can also delete a trait from a population. You can also crash a population. So you can create a situation where all of the offspring are males. And they keep mating and create more males. And eventually, it'll be this one big bachelor party with very few females, and they will be wiped out. And so that's one way that you can use gene drives to destroy a species. They're looking at different ways of using gene drives in the military, conservation, health, and agriculture. The one that you'll hear about is not the Department of Defense. The one that you hear about is it sounds very altruistic. And maybe the people that thought of it are well-meaning without a deep understanding of what could go wrong. They want to kill off the mosquito that carries malaria. Now, I can tell you that in a non-gene drive situation, a company from the UK called Oxitec brought up genetically engineered mosquitoes to reduce the population of the Aedes aegypti that carries Zika and dengue. And I testified against them, and the South Florida mosquito control district. And I remember talking to the Oxitec scientist years ago, and I tried to explain to him that they were making changes that could be inheritable and a permanent part of the gene pool. Now, he had testified that only 3% of the offspring survive, and when there's presence of tetracycline for some reasons, then it's up to 18%. But he was absolutely convinced and promised me up and down that there was no way that a release of his mosquitoes could change the nature of nature. As soon as they stopped releasing, they would die off. So they released millions of them in Brazil. And about 3 years later, they started testing the mosquitoes. And sure enough, in 60% of the samplings, they found changes in the genome of the mosquito. So it was a combination of the local mosquitoes and the two types of genes brought in from these Oxitec mosquitoes. Now, the author said clearly, we don't know what this means. It might mean that these mosquitoes are harder to kill. It might mean that they carry more disease or less disease. We don't know. But it was not anticipated, and it's now permanent. I'm sorry to say that Oxitec is now planning to release genetically engineered mosquitoes in the Florida Keys, I believe, next week. It's a disaster. And as I remember talking to Derek Nemo, who is the scientist from Oxitec, I said, Derek, the mosquito's saliva gets into our blood. Have you tested the mosquito's saliva to see if it's dangerous? He said, we're just now doing the test to see if the protein that's produced by the inserted gene ends up in the saliva of the mosquito. Now, if you're paying attention, there's two things that are shocking. Well, you didn't know the timing of this. So the first thing is they've already released millions of mosquitoes in 4 countries, and they've never checked. They never looked at the saliva of their genetically engineered mosquito to see if it could be allergenic or toxic or carcinogenic to the people who get bitten by the mosquitoes. So first of all, it was incredibly irresponsible. Second, it was bad science. Because I said to him, you know, Derek, the process of genetic engineering creates massive collateral damage. And the insertion of a single gene can change the gene expression of many, many other genes. So in a human cell, this was a cystic fibrosis study, they put in a single gene, and as many as 5% of the other human genes changed how much protein they were producing. When you change the amount of protein, you can increase an allergen or a toxin or an anti-nutrient or carcinogen. You can decrease something that's important. I said, shouldn't you be checking the entire saliva of the mosquito and not just the presence of a single protein? And I'll never forget his answer. He said, good idea. So these are the people that are in charge of the gene pool. The people who are experimenting on us and realize, oh, it was probably a good idea if we do a little bit of safety evaluation. So I can't imagine what they're thinking about in terms of target malaria. I saw a presentation at the Convention of Biological Diversity of these folks, and they sidestep all possible things that can go wrong. The possibility that first of all, there could be an ecosystem damage and collapse if you take out an entire species, but the genes could transfer. You could be transferring something that you don't know. You could actually increase the likelihood of those mosquitoes causing problems because we do not have a deep understanding of what our changes will do, and we do not have a technology to do just what we want to do, but many other things happen at the same time. Also at that meeting, a group was talking about trying to use genetic engineering gene drives to kill off mice on islands. Now, altruistic, this is conservation, right? The mice came on ships and got into the ecosystem, are eating the birds, the baby birds or their eggs, and they're destroying the ecosystem. So let's destroy all the mice. What could go wrong? Well, how did those mice get there in the first place? On the hulls of ships. So what happens if those mice end up on a mainland, sending their gene drive and destroying the mouse population there, all over the world? Or what happens if the gene transfers to something else? I said earlier that this year they discovered gene transfer between plants and animals. That could give you goosebumps if you think about gene drives. Right now, they're trying to destroy, they're proposing that they use gene drives to kill off a fruit fly. And there are some major players you've seen, Bayer Monsanto and others. Agrogene wants to alter plants and insects. Agrogene is advertising bee-friendly, organic, eco-sustainable, the smart choice for affordable biocontrol. Change the nature of nature and trust us. There's a company, there's a patent actually, to make crops that have become resistant to Roundup to then become susceptible again. And they have a way that the gene drives could then make them susceptible and not resistant to 167 chemicals. So here, they want to use gene drives to make chemical herbicides more effective. This is insanity. They want to use a gene drive to disarm a deadly wheat pathogen. They're talking about changing the nature of nature with livestock so that it has the qualities that those who process the livestock for food will benefit from. So if anyone is into animal rights, pay attention here. In Beijing, there were scientists that wanted to use CRISPR. They proposed to disrupt the odor sensing genes in grasshoppers that are responsible for locust swarming behavior, and that a gene drive could spread it throughout the grasshopper population. There's even a bizarre patent to use a gene drive for honeybees and then equip them with ways to control them with sound. If you look at all the different things that have been proposed, they can change the nature of an entire farm. All these different gene drives putting together a new genetic pool, a new ecosystem designed by companies that want to sell herbicides, that want to process livestock, etc. There's been an outcry from some major voices saying there should not be gene drives in conservation, meaning don't use it to kill off the mice, don't use it to kill off, to try and resculpture the ecosystem. There was our organization was one of 150 calling for a global moratorium. And although the UN did not, the Convention on Biological Diversity did not, as we had hoped, ban gene drives, they now require notification, proper informing. So there's still work to do. So it turns out that gene editing can create gene drives. So imagine for a moment, or not, that you can, when you pay for that $2,000 home laboratory, that you can also build gene drives and change the nature of nature all over the world on purpose. So this is another example of a GMO 2.0 technology. And if we run out of questions, Ben, I can talk about another. I don't have the slides for it, but we can talk about RNA interference. We could talk about HEGAs. We could talk about other things, but you get the sense of what we're doing now. Years ago, I sat in a a restaurant with a friend of mine trying to think of all the ways we could redefine GMO, and I coined the term "God move over," and now we see how appropriate that is. Let's take some questions.
Jeffrey, thank you so much for sharing all of that, all those extra slides and all of that information as well. We do have a question coming in now. And again, everyone, please, we've got Jeffrey here all to ourselves. This is remarkable. If you have any questions, go ahead, hit the reactions button on the bottom of your Zoom page. That raises up a little menu and you can click raise hand. Go ahead and raise your hand and we'll be able to call on you. We do have Kelly who is ready to ask a question of you, Jeffrey. So Kelly, go ahead and unmute yourself if you would. I think you've done that. Thank you. Hi, Kelly.
Hi. So I did reterm GMO, and my husband and I created a business with farmers called Get My Own, where we totally promote advocacy for growing your own food. And granted, we've heard recently that, and this may be all controversy about checking the reality of a label saying, not genetically modified, really look into the farmers to see how ethical it is. But my question is, where is the future? If, everyone's concerned about global warming, but our biodiversity and our earth and our micro gut is being changed by this. So I'm promoting this, but is there hope for the future? It feels like we're just going to die off or deplete. So what is the future going to look like? How can we avoid, this just depletion of real food?
Okay, so there's two things. There's food and then there's the microbiome. As far as the microbiome is concerned, it's a serious problem because we have democratized the gene pool, giving people an opportunity to introduce things that can travel around the world and wreak havoc. But the timing is unbelievably perfect for us to introduce new legislation. The timing is perfect for us to raise the alarm. And people are getting it. I mean, your organization is welcome to become an ally. We can put your logo on our site, as we're doing we have 40 others right now. We hope to have thousands, because people are getting it. And I think that together we will actually lock it down, because like I said, it's not hard to convey. And by focusing on implementing lessons from the pandemic, we are meeting a need with real practical solutions. Now, as far as the food supply goes, first of all, thank you for your work in your GMO. What was that? Get more, what was it?
It's get my own, grow my own, gather my own. Yeah.
Okay, beautiful. So what's happening is, as people learn more about the dangers of GMOs and Roundup, and there's more information on that all the time. There was just a study put out by my friend Dr. Michael Antonio in King's College London, who took 6 common pesticides that are often found together on food and fed them to rats, and noticed that there were changes that would not have been seen by traditional methods. But when he used the more in-depth analysis, molecular analysis, he found serious damage that could lead to diseases, showing that all of the regulatory review processes around the world are basically a facade. None of them would have picked up these changes. And so what do? You eat organic. So there is, as technology progresses, as the chemicals progress, as the GMOs progress, the need to be organic is growing. So you mentioned the verification process. The non-GMO project is, from my vantage point, the best third-party verifier for non-GMO. They are way up to speed on the new GMOs, the gene editing, etc. So if something is non-GMO project verified, it has the highest likelihood that even these little new GMOs will be excluded. But I would recommend having organic also, because that eliminates all the pesticides. So if I had to choose between non-GMO project and organic, I'd go for organic, and ideally both. We've talked about that before. So I actually think that the demand is growing, and what's happening is, in our system, the most vulnerable are being damaged, the children. and I've been talking to my friend pediatrician, Dr. Michelle Perro, who wrote the book, What's Making Our Children Sick? And if you look at the book, it's GMOs and Roundup, primary driver. So knowing that, we have the generation of parents, the generation of doctors, the generation of those who are observing, saying we need to make a change. So the depth of understanding is growing among a subset of the population, and that is securing the organic supply chain for those that need it. And unfortunately, it's not everyone, but half the population now believes that GMOs are unsafe, and that's driving the food companies away from GMOs. So it's working. Thank you for that excellent question.
Jeffrey, thank you. We have another question now, and forgive me if I'm butchering your name. I'm not sure if it's Zana or Zaina, but you are up next if you wouldn't mind unmuting yourself.
Great, it's Anna. Hi, everyone. I'm wondering, what's your opinion on the mRNA vaccines that are being introduced to the market that some refer to as gene therapy, and if they will have the same effect as the yellow fly that you just described in like 3-4 generations, given that the future generation mix those that are vaccinated and those that are not vaccinated. Thank you.
Well, Zana, I mentioned earlier that I'm not an expert at vaccines in general or this particular messenger RNA, so I'm going to pass on the question. I don't know enough to comment, and I certainly don't know enough to give advice. So it is an important question, and I'll be looking for the answer along with you.
Jeffrey, thank you. And so now we have Renee. Renee, if you would go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hello. I'm wondering if you can explain how exactly the human microbiome, how the GMOs affect our microbiome. Like, what do they actually do?
Well, first of all, we're operating here without a lot of research. There's over 50,000 studies done on the human microbiome. Their studies are not on the genetic engineering of the human microbiome, they're on the human microbiome. And they've correlated certain changes in the microbiome to autism, certain ones to cancer. So they're really good at understanding the changes. I remember talking to Kiran Krishnan, who had done some research on the impact of Roundup on the human gut microbiome and saw changes. And I listed 28 different conditions that people reported getting better from when they switched to organic food. And he showed how each one of those conditions could be exacerbated or caused by the changes in the microbiome simply because of the loss of diversity, the increase in pathogens, the reduction in short-chain fatty acids, et cetera. So that's the chemical. But you asked about GMOs, which is very important. For years, the only knowledge that I had came from a 2004 publication at Nature Biotechnology. It was Netherwood et al. It was about the fact that they found that the part of the gene that had been inserted into soybeans, making the soybeans resistant to death by Roundup, transferred into the DNA of gut bacteria. Now, we don't know what would happen if that's common. It could be already happening. If it did transfer, if it did switch on, if it were functioning, it means that these bacteria would have extra protection against the Roundup residues in food. So it would drive artificially a change in the diversity and the balance. I raised the point that we're eating corn chips made from genetically engineered corn that's engineered to produce a toxic insecticide called Bt toxin. What if that transfers to the DNA of bacteria living inside our intestines and continues to function? It might be producing the Bt protein. The Bt protein has at least two qualities that we don't want produced inside our gut. First of all, it provokes an immune response, allergic response, and also causes the body to react to other formerly harmless compounds. So we could be creating immune and allergic responses by a protein produced by our own intestinal flora. But the Bt toxin is designed in agriculture to kill certain insects by drilling holes in the walls of their intestines. So it might be creating leaky gut in the middle of the cells along the walls of the intestines. It's only one cell thick. Leaky gut, according to one researcher in Harvard, is the cause of all diseases. So that could be a problem. Now, there was a study done in Canada where 93% of the pregnant women tested had the Bt toxin circulating in their blood and in 80% of their unborn fetuses. How did it get in the blood? Possibly through holes that it drilled itself. What happens in the blood? Well, there's evidence that it's toxic to red blood cells. And what happens when it gets into the baby? Well, the blood-brain barrier is not well developed. So now you have Bt toxin maybe in the brain of the baby. And what does it do? It pokes holes in cells. Now, that's just one theoretical example. In truth, no one knows. But that's like a logical step. If the gene that produces the toxin transfers to gut bacteria and continues to function, it might turn our intestinal flora into living pesticide factories. I asked Kiran Krishnan in an interview, can you think of a well-meaning release in agriculture that would have a negative impact if it ended up in our gut bacteria? And he came up with this. He said, okay, if you're releasing a probiotic in a field, you want it to take hold. There's a lot of other competing microbes, so you want it to dominate. So you can create antimicrobials in the microbe that kill off other microbes that allow it to survive. And so that it survives, you create an antibiotic resistance among that microbe. So that microbe has an armor. It kills off the others and it protects itself from being killed. So now you've populated that field with your microbe so it does whatever you want it to do. Fix nitrogen, whatever. If that microbe ends up on the food and we eat the food, it may transfer those extra genetic functions to pathogens living inside our gut. Our microbes want that kind of stuff because they're into survival. If someone said, okay, here's a machine gun, here's a shield, do you want it? You're in a battle, do you want it? Oh, yeah, sure. So imagine that the pathogens now are protected from antibiotics and also have antimicrobials that kill their enemies. So there are, in the normal gut bacteria, there's something called quorum sensing, where the bacteria will check out and see what the diversity is. They'll look at the pathogens. If there's too many pathogens, it'll surround those pathogens, reduce the population. They're like the hall monitors for the entire microbiome. What if they get killed off by these pathogens that are equipped, newly equipped with these additional microbes from the soil? And because they provide a survival advantage, maybe they take hold and become the new norm in human microbiomes. Now, I have to admit that I'm speaking theoretically. I'm not aware of research that's ever been done on these type of things, but I can tell you that 70% of the microbes in our gut have never been cultured, properly identified. There's far more in the soil, millions. We're babes in the woods. And I think someone told me in a teaspoon of soil, there are more microbes than people on Earth. And we've hardly characterized them. So we don't really know. And because we don't know and have very little understanding about where our microbial creations can go and what they can do, there's no justification for releasing any outdoors, given what's at stake.
Jeffrey, thank you for that. And we do have another question now from Joel. Joel, welcome back. And if you would go ahead and unmute yourself, and we'd love to take your question for Jeffrey again.
Jeffrey, thank you again. In 51 years of Earth days, I've observed a lot. In about 15 years ago, in Tampa, at the University of South Florida, I attended an open forum for how to make money in genetics, and saw a whole bunch of lawyers and public relations people in this forum. Going back to the Cuyahoga River, I want to mention this because it's troubling. I have students that saw flames go over bridges. It was the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland was so toxic, it caught on fire. And it prompted the Clean Water Act. And the Clean Water Act said, legislators, lawyers said that there'll be no dumping of toxic heavy metals into the Cuyahoga River or toxins of any kind, except if you have a permit. This is very troubling, Jeffrey. And with this catastrophic potential of genetics, how do we really wake people up?
You know, your point is excellent. Someone handed me a book years ago, and he told me about the book. I didn't have to read it because he told me the main point. I think it was called "Who Will Tell the People," and I looked through it. And it was about how movements can get the laws passed, and then hands off to the EPA, and then EPA has committees to determine the standards of what's allowed, and that's where the industry comes in and determines all the standards. So we have a movement that says, okay, we need to clean up the water, but then when it's come Clean Water Act, who's writing that act? Whose influence is becoming the regulation that the industry needs to follow? It's all too often the industry. So our program, our strategy is to create new laws that are specific, that assign liability, so that if someone says, "Oh yeah, if you're releasing stuff into the river, according to an act of Congress, you have to pay for it completely." What is their insurance company going to do? Is the insurance company going to say, "Oh yeah, we'll insure you, no problem"? No. You see, the system of regulation has been corrupted and captured by the biotech industry, by industry in general. I can speak about the biotech industry. I can talk about that with a lot of confidence because I've read the documents made public from a lawsuit. I understand it was Monsanto's former attorney who was in charge of GMO policy and later became Monsanto's vice president and then went back to the FDA as the US food czar. So I understand the capturing of regulatory agencies. So we're not going to the regulators to say, do the people's bidding. We're going to Congress and saying, please dictate very clearly what we need in order to protect all living beings and all future generations. So that's our best efforts right now. But we're also going to be going to international treaties so that if there's international trade and release of microbes, a country can take another country to task. And there'll be a level of lockdown that will be enormous. And speaking of lockdown, John asks, are you asking that all gene editing be stopped? If not, what gene editing or gene editing research do you support? So I'll make it very simple and say, keep it in the lab. Well, first of all, I don't support gene editing that would enhance a potentially pandemic pathogen, indoors, outdoors, at all. For the others, I'm not against the use of genetic engineering for research. I'm not against human gene therapy that's not inheritable. On yesterday's panel, Dr. Michael Antonio spoke out about the dangers of gene editing and the mismatch between those dangers and the government regulations. How does he know? Because he's a genetic engineer. He has 130 published studies. He has patents. And his area is enhancing the gene therapy research on humans that have defective genes, not in an inheritable way, but in just affecting that person. So he does gene editing. He does genetic engineering. I'm not against that. But I'm not in favor, and nor is he, of genetically engineering organisms and releasing them in the environment of any type. Protect Nature Now is focused on the microbiome. And I'm not in favor of releasing GMOs or the products of GMOs into the food supply, because that exposes the entire population to the organisms or their byproducts that can be dangerous. So that's where I step up in terms of our Institute for Responsible Technology. For Protect Nature Now, it's a little more focused on the microbiome and no outdoor release of microbes or indoor enhancement of pathogens that can cause pandemics.
Jeffrey, thank you for that. At the moment, that's all the questions that we have. We have about 10 to 15 minutes before our next lecture. And you had mentioned you had a few more thoughts of some things that you could share. If you're open to that, we'd love to tap your knowledge.
Sure. Here's another GMO 2.0, RNA interference. I remember speaking to my friend, Dr. Don Huber, who was a professor emeritus of Purdue University. Years ago, we were sitting in a car and he said, you know, Jeffrey, the future GMOs are going to be even worse. Now, he knew a lot about the GMOs. He had worked as a consultant for Monsanto on Roundup, blew the whistle on it. And he was talking about RNA interference. And that's where you can reprogram gene expression. So the Arctic apple, we call it the Botox apple because it lies about its age. You can slice the apple, it won't turn brown. It'll just shrink over time. Because they put in RNA, little piece of double-stranded RNA that finds its DNA counterpart and silences its expression so it doesn't create a protein. So the protein that turns the apple brown is shut off. But we know from research on mammals, insects, others, that double-stranded RNA that silences that stretch of DNA can also theoretically silence ours. So if you bite that apple and that double-stranded RNA starts circulating in our system, it might find a match. Now, the size of that double-stranded RNA is 22 nucleotides. We have 2 billion base pairs. We have 4 codes. It's not hard to do the math. What are the chances that there's a lineup? 100%. Many, many. Because it not only lines up with exact, but also similar. So if it's circulating in our DNA and it's still functioning, it may find a match. And if it does, it might silence our genes. This was of grave concern to scientists who are aware of this capacity. There was a study done on honeybees. They fed them some double-stranded RNA in one meal, and they fed them, the RNA was from a protein that causes glowing in the dark. And it had no relationship whatsoever with honeybees, so they figured, great, this will be one of the controls. Let's just verify what we already know, that it'll have no influence on the honeybee's genetic expression. It'll just pass, it'll have so then that will be our negative control in future studies, because it'll have no impact. They fed it to the larva stage, and then they tested the gene expression of the honeybees twice over time. 10% of the genes of the honeybee, over 1,400, changed their levels of expression when they ate a single meal of double-stranded RNA. we're eating these pre-sliced apples available on Amazon. Are they changing our gene expression? Now, for those technically minded, it wasn't hooking up with 1,400 genes. It was hooking up with a smaller number. We'll call that primary change. Those changes then created additional changes in the DNA. We'll call those secondary changes. They didn't sort out which were primary, which were secondary. They were just blown away because this double-stranded RNA, which was not supposed to have any impact, had such massive change. The EPA is approving sprays, pesticidal sprays. You spray on the crops, it gets on the insects, and it stops vital genes from expressing and kills the crops. Everyone knows that if you get spray on your skin, it can be absorbed. There's what I consider to be a fun yet horrific example of how Monsanto tried to hide the absorbability of Roundup. It came out in the recent trial. I'd like to share that just because I have so much delight explaining what Monsanto science looks like. They're required to test the absorbability, and we'll get back to the RNA sprays in a minute. They put Roundup on human cadaver skin and 10% absorbed, which is over 3 times the amount of legal limit. So they never told the EPA, which they were required to do. They violated that law. And instead, they took some human skin from a cadaver and they baked it in an oven. Then they froze it. Took that leather-like human skin and put Roundup on it, and little or no Roundup was absorbed. And that was what they reported to the EPA. Entirely rigged research that had nothing to do with reality. That came out at the Roundup trials, where people had non-Hodgkin lymphoma after using Roundup. And Lee Johnson, who I've interviewed, who won the first case, he was drenched with Roundup when a problem happened with the hose, and he was spraying in a school district, got drenched with Roundup, and ended up with welts and rashes and non-Hodgkin lymphoma. So now we have an RNAi spray that could theoretically get into plants, insects, birds, mice, and people who are spraying, and might change their DNA expression. I remember interviewing a former USDA scientist who actually basically got pushed out of the USDA because he published a paper saying we don't have the ability to properly assess the safety of RNA interference because it could influence all these different non-target species. He was talking about the non-target species of insects or animals. And I said, but aren't we an on-target species? He said, oh yeah. So that's another GMO 2.0 that we need to address. The Department of Defense has another one called HEGAs, and that's creating bees that deposit genetically engineered viruses into crops so that the genetic engineering is in the field. I hope I'm not disturbing. So these are some examples of what we're faced with, but I actually feel like our way into this through the pandemic lens, through the microbiome, we're going to be educating the population and the lawmakers to actually take back control of the gene pool. It was fun. It's always fun to expose Monsanto because when people realize the blatant way that they manipulate science and lie to regulators, it does the heavy lifting for us because they're the ones trying to say, oh, no, everything is safe and easy and protected. Gene editing's fine, look the other way, squirrel. So they're doing that, and we're saying, this is the same company that when they hired a consultant in Anniston, Alabama, outside their PCB factory, the consultant put fish in the local brook, and within 10 seconds, they shed their skin, floated to the top, and spurted blood. And the response by Monsanto was nothing. In fact, they wrote in a memo, we can't afford to lose $1 of business, even though they were poisoning the people in the town. This is the same company that's in charge of the gene pool if we allow their genetics to go forward. They were bought by Bayer. So we are framing the truth in a way that people can understand to drive change. We have driven behavior change among consumers. Now we are also driving new laws. So let me finish up by giving this understanding. I think as I've traveled around the world, I've seen an epidemic of passing on responsibility to others. I remember talking to a member of a government or regulatory agency in a particular country, and he said, we don't have to test GMOs because the FDA does it. No, he said, your FDA does it. And I pointed out that the FDA does not test GMOs. In fact, they don't require any testing whatsoever. They say that people like Monsanto, companies like Monsanto, can determine on their own if the GMOs are safe. And here's how Monsanto tests. So the person was shocked. But this concept of othering, giving others the responsibility, is built into our educational systems. It's built into the way the media and the government have been operating, this sense that it's not my responsibility. It creates a sense of personal depletion, lack of sovereignty, lack of responsibility. And that allows these things to unfold. So we are reversing that. We have reversed it a lot in genetically engineered foods by making our own choice and say, I will consider and choose what I consider to be a food and what I consider to be an FSO, a food-shaped object. And I'm not going to be listening to Monsanto or their enforcement wing in Washington. I will make the choice. Here we're stepping up to say, we, humanity, will protect all living beings and all future generations. You see, we can look at this as a burden. We can feel angry. We can feel sad. We can feel fear. Let's turn that food into sovereignty, instead of being a victim, be a victor, and say, we are part of a humanity now that has the technology to do unprecedented harm. So what we need to do is create an unprecedented new vision for humanity, that we are stewards of all living beings and all future generations. We need to safeguard biological evolution as we know it, now that we have a technology to destroy it. We need to step up and give people that vision, that hope, and that truth. And this then becomes an opportunity. Because when we step up and look beyond our narrow boundaries and step up to say, I will be responsible with humanity to take care of this, we are antidoting that one epidemic of othering that can change everything. So this is an opportunity where we can take one issue, which is urgent, and it is an existential threat like no other, and we can use it to expand the role and vision of humanity, and we can all be leaders in that. So I invite everyone to step up to do something that none of our ancestors could do. They couldn't protect all living beings and all future generations. They didn't have technology that could harm all living beings and future generations. So now we have an opportunity to do more good than anyone in human history. So let's take that as an honor. Let's take that as an opportunity. Please visit Protect Nature Now. Please watch the film. Please share the film. Share the trailer. The trailer has over 500,000 views. Make it another 150 or 1,000 views through your social media. Go onto our activist platform. Make a donation. Step up. Even if you can afford $5 a month, be part of the team. Don't say, oh, I don't have enough money, so I can't be responsible. I can't contribute. You notice what happens? Oh, I don't have enough. Change that thinking. I have what I have. I'm participating. I have this much time. I have this much friends. I have this position on Facebook. I have these kind of influence. And I'm going to participate and help all living beings and all future generations because that's what I choose to do. So thank you all for sharing today with me. And thank you, Ben, for running this amazing conference. Thank you to Stephen Shore. And I really appreciate the questions that we've had. And I now see people, hello from Greece, from Canada, from Germany, from all over the world. This is a global issue. Let's feel that connectivity of everyone on Earth stepping up and make it happen. Thanks.
Jeffrey, I don't know if you could hear it while you were speaking, but I think we just heard this collective amen all over the world. Thank you so much for everything that you shared today. We sure do appreciate it.